Hi everybody, and welcome to Blue and White ASMR. In today's video, we're going to talk about who are the Jews of Israel. This question opens a vast and complex story that stretches across millennia. The Jewish people living in the land of Israel today represent a rich mosaic of communities, histories, languages, and traditions. They include those who have maintained an unbroken presence in the land for generations, as well as those who returned after centuries of exile, bringing with them customs shaped by life in distant lands. Through this journey, we will meet Ashkenazi Jews from Europe, Sephardi Jews from the Iberian Peninsula and the Mediterranean, Mizrahi Jews rooted in Middle Eastern cultures, Ethiopian Jews with ancient ties to the land, Russian and Soviet immigrants, and those Jewish communities who never left Israel's soil. The Jewish people trace their origins to the ancient land of Israel, where their identity began to take shape more than 3,000 years ago, long before the rise of centralized monarchies of foreign empires. Small highland communities in the hill country of Judea and Samaria began to form a distinct culture, rooted in shared ancestry, language, spiritual practices, and a deep connection to the land. Archaeological discoveries from sites such as Shiloh, Bet El, and Tel Dan reveal settlements typical of early Israelite society during the Iron Age. These early villages often consisted of simple stone homes arranged around open courtyards, reflecting a tribal and family-based society rather than an urban or royal one. The four-room house structure, found across dozens of Israelite sites, became a hallmark of early Jewish domestic life. Agricultural roots, storage jars, and communal grain silos all point to a life built around farming and seasonal rhythms, closely tied to the land and its blessings. One of the most significant archaeological finds is the Tel Dan stele, a fragmentary inscription from the 9th century BCE that refers to the house of David, Beit David, offering early external confirmation of Davidic kingship and the historical roots of Jewish nationhood. The Israelites developed and used early forms of Hebrew writing derived from Proto-Canaanite script, but evolving into its own unique expression. The Gezer calendar, an inscription dating to the 10th century BCE, describes agricultural cycles in ancient Hebrew and is among the earliest textual artifacts written in the language of the Jewish people. Their pottery, simple and unadorned compared to the neighboring Philistine or Canaanite ceramics, speaks to a cultural ethos grounded in modesty and functionality. Storage jars, oil lamps, and cooking vessels show a lifestyle centered on agriculture and self-sufficiency. Wheat, barley, olives, figs, and grapes form the basis of the diet. Food remaining from these sites show a clear absence of non-kosher animals, most notably pigs, reinforcing the early roots of dietary laws that would later become core to Jewish identity. Livestock remains indicate a reliance on sheep and goats, animals central to both sustenance and early Jewish ritual life. Though musical sounds themselves do not survive, there is strong evidence both archaeological and textual, that music played a central role in early Israelite life. Lyres, cymbals, and flutes were likely part of celebratory and religious events, and are later described in the Tanakh as essential elements of worship, especially during the Temple period. Song and poetry would become defining features of Jewish spiritual life, a tradition that arguably began even in these early communities. Burial customs in ancient Israel reflected strong familial bonds and deep reverence for ancestry. Family cave tombs, often reused across generations, have been found in the Judean hills and in the environs of ancient Jerusalem. These burials were intimate and community-centered, aligning the Jewish concept of kever avot, the burial place of ancestors, and the enduring link between generations. In terms of religious practice, the Israelites of this period worshipped the God of Israel. Shrines discovered at sites such as Arad and Tel Motza provide rare glimpses into early modes of worship, including altars and incense offerings. While some aspects of these findings remain debated, they show a growing spiritual distinctiveness and a path that would later culminate in the centralized worship of the God of Israel in the First Temple. The Jewish people's earliest presence in the land of Israel is well documented, not only through the Tanakh, but also through archaeology and cultural history. These ancient communities form the bedrock of Jewish identity. The history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel entered a new era with the rise of the Israelite and Judean monarchies. The transformation from a tribal society to an organized kingdom marked both political centralization and religious evolution. By the 10th century BCE, the united monarchy under kings Saul, David, and Solomon established Jerusalem as a political and spiritual center. Following the division of the kingdom, two states emerged, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Each developed distinct political histories, but shared cultural and religious practices rooted in the worship of the God of Israel and in Israelite identity. Kingship in ancient Israel and Judah was deeply intertwined with religious duty. The king was not only a political leader, but also a patron of national worship, often associated with the protection of the temple or sacred spaces. The construction of the first temple in Jerusalem by King Solomon around 960 BCE was a defining moment in Jewish history, formalizing a central place for prayer, sacrifice, and pilgrimage. Public festivals tied to the agricultural cycle, such as Pesach or Passover, Shavuot or weeks, and Sukkot, the tabernacles, were not only expressions of spiritual devotion, but also mechanisms for unifying the people around shared memory and divine law. These holidays blended agricultural rhythms with historical narratives, affirming a collective sense of purpose and identity rooted in the land. Temple ritual life was central to Israelite society. Daily offerings, sacred music, and the maintenance of purity laws regulated public worship. The priesthood, or Kohanim, and the Levites played vital roles in sustaining this spiritual structure, while scribes and sages began to codify and transmit religious teachings and law, a process that would become critical in later centuries. The northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE. Many Israelites were exiled or displaced, and some assimilated into surrounding populations. Though much remains unclear about their fate, their removal marked the beginning of widespread Jewish dispersion. The more deeply documented exile occurred after the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah and the first temple by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. The temple was destroyed, and a significant portion of the Judean population was deported to Babylon. This exile represented both a national catastrophe and a turning point in Jewish history. Far from resulting in cultural erasure, the Babylonian exile initiated a transformation. Bereft of their land, temple, and monarchy, the exiled Judeans preserved their identity through new models of religious life. The roots of rabbinic Judaism. In foreign lands, they began to gather in communal prayer spaces, study sacred texts, and adapt their worship from temple-centered rituals to portable practices focused on Torah, prayer, and law. Faced with exile, the Judeans anchored their collective memory in sacred texts, particularly those that would later form the Tanakh. The editing, copying, and transmission of biblical narratives, legal codes, and prophetic writings became central to communal life in Babylon and other diaspora centers. Synagogues began to emerge as houses of study and gathering, precursors to the spiritual infrastructure of Jewish life in exile. Ritual observance, such as keeping Shabbat, observing Kashrut, circumcision, and celebrating festivals, became identity markers, a way to maintain distinctiveness while living among foreign people. These practices, once rooted in temple and land, were adapted to new settings, while still recalling their sacred origins. The exile also fostered a theology of hope and return. Prophets like Yechezkel, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, reimagined the covenantal relationship between the Jewish people and their God. This idea that exile was not an end, but part of a larger sacred journey, would sustain generations of Jews through the centuries of displacement. The journey from monarchy to exile was not just a fall from political sovereignty. It was a test of spiritual endurance and cultural adaptability. What emerged was a resilient Jewish identity. With the destruction of the first and later the second temple, and successive waves of conquest and exile, Jews were dispersed across the vast stretches of the ancient world. From Babylon and Persia to North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, and beyond, Jewish communities established themselves far from their ancestral homeland. Yet, despite the geographical distance, linguistic shifts, and exposure to diverse cultures, these communities remained connected through shared texts, rituals, and a sense of collective destiny. Diaspora Jewish communities developed rich, localized cultures while navigating the tension between integration and preservation. Jews often adapted to the legal systems, languages, and economic realities of their host societies, sometimes becoming key figures in trade, scholarship, and administration. Yet, amid these adaptations, Jewish communities maintained a distinct identity rooted in religious observance, communal autonomy, and the Jewish calendar. Rabbinic leadership played a crucial role in guiding communities on how to uphold halachic integrity within diverse contexts. Jewish legal texts, such as the Mishnah, Talmud, evolved to address the changing realities of diaspora life, offering guidance on how to observe Jewish law in non-Jewish environments. In many cases, local Jewish communities were granted semi-autonomous status, allowing them to govern their internal affairs through kehillah or community structures. These institutions ensured the continuity of Jewish education, charity, dispute resolution, and ritual life, while shielding the community to varying degrees from external influence and persecution. Jewish identity in the diaspora was also preserved through the meticulous observance of daily and life cycle customs. Dietary laws, kashrut, including rules about slaughtering animals, avoiding certain food combinations, and maintaining separate utensils, were upheld with creativity and local adaptation. In India, for example, Jews developed kosher practices using coconut oil instead of animal fats. In Morocco, Jewish cuisine blended local spices with biblical food laws to create distinctive Shabbat and festival dishes. Traditional dress codes also served as markers of identity, while styles varied by region, from the flowing robes of Sephardi Jews in the Ottoman Empire to the distinctive black hats and long coats of Eastern European Ashkenazim. The principle of modesty and cultural continuity was shared across communities. Dress often symbolized more than religious observance. It was a form of resistance against assimilation and a declaration of loyalty. Life cycle events, circumcision, bar mitzvahs, weddings, and mourning rituals provided a structure of belonging and continuity. These ceremonies not only marked individual passages, but reaffirmed collective and communal bonds. Marriage contracts, known as ktubot, blessings, and customs surrounding birth and death varied in form but reflected the same core values across continents. Out of necessity and creativity, Jews in the diaspora gave rise to vibrant cultural expressions that blended tradition with local influence. Nowhere is this more evident than in language. Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, Ladino, which is Judeo-Spanish, and Yiddish, a Germanic Hebrew fusion, were born in the diaspora, allowing Jews to maintain inner cohesion while communicating with the surrounding world. These languages incorporated Hebrew and Aramaic terms, making them tools for both spiritual discourse and everyday life. Liturgic music and prayer developed unique flavors in each region. In North Africa and the Middle East, the Makam system influenced synagogue chanting, infusing Torah readings with rich modal expression. Ashkenazi Jews in Europe developed nigunim, wordless melodies that expressed deep longing and joy, often used in Hasidic spirituality. Sephardic communities preserved ancient piyutim, or liturgical poems and melodies passed down through oral tradition, especially during high holiday services. Prayer itself, while based on shared texts such as the Siddur or prayer book, reflected regional nuance. Differences in pronunciation, musical modes, and customs around blessings reflected the diversity of the Jewish world. And yet, a Jew from Poland and a Jew from Yemen could recite the Shema or read from the Torah and feel a profound sense of unity. In the diaspora, Jewish people became not just survivors of exile, but stewards of a living tradition. Across centuries and continents, they preserved an identity that was both resilient and dynamic. Through language, song, food, ritual, and law, Jewish communities continue to write their shared story, a story that remains deeply rooted in the land of Israel, but enriched by global experience and expression. The Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, rooted in the medieval Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe, represents one of the most historically prolific and culturally influential streams of the Jewish people. Over the course of a millennium, Ashkenazi Jews developed a richly textured civilization, complete with its own language, educational systems, musical styles, foodways, legal thought, and spiritual philosophies that shape Jewish identity far beyond the European continent. Though Ashkenaz began as a geographic term for the Rhineland region of medieval Germany, it eventually came to refer to an entire cultural world that extended eastward into Poland, Lithuania, Russia, Hungary, Ukraine, and Romania. It was in these lands that Jewish life would flourish and suffer on a massive scale. At the heart of the Ashkenazi life was the Yiddish language, a fusion of medieval German with Hebrew, Aramaic, and later Slavic vocabulary. More than a means of communication, Yiddish was collective humor and the emotional cadence of the shtetl. Yiddish literature eventually grew into a vast, world-class tradition. In the 19th and 20th centuries, writers like Shalom Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, and Peretz Markish gave voice to the daily life of Eastern European Jews. The language was also fiercely political. Yiddish was the mother tongue of secular Jewish socialists, Bundists, and early feminists, as well as devout Hasidim. It carried both revolutionary manifestos and lullabies. It was banned by tsars, cherished by immigrants, and tragically silenced in much of Europe by the Holocaust. Ashkenazi religious life developed its own distinctive modes of prayer and sacred song. The nigunim, wordless melodies used especially by Hasidic Jews, served as a form of spiritual elevation. These tunes, sometimes meditative and slow, other times ecstatic and fast, were designed to open the heart beyond language, lifting the soul into communion with Hashem. Klezmer music, performed at weddings and festivals, was deeply connected to these sacred roots. Originally the province of professional Jewish musicians, Klezmorim, Klezmer drew on Eastern European folk idioms and cantorial modes. It features fiddles, clarinets, cymbals, and later brass instruments, weaving joy, melancholy, and celebration into a musical language of its own. In both form and feeling, Klezmer echoed the deep interplay between sorrow and resilience that marked so much of Ashkenazi life. Hasidim, which emerged in the 18th century in regions like Podolia and Galicia, was a spiritual revolution. Founded by Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, Hasidim emphasized joy, simplicity, and intimate connections to the divine over scholasticism and legalism. Hasidic tales often featuring righteous figures, tzaddikim, miracles, and moral tests, became a cornerstone of Ashkenazi storytelling and remain vibrant in Hasidic communities to this day. Ashkenazi cuisine developed under the constraints of kashrut, poverty, and the ingenuity of homemakers who turned modest ingredients into enduring traditions. It reflected the geography and climate of Eastern Europe, root vegetables, poultry, grains, and preserved foods, as well as religious rhythms that centered food on spiritual and communal life. Challah, the braided bread of Shabbat and holidays, symbolized both abundance and sanctity. Gefilte fish, a seasoned fish loaf often made from carp, pike, or whitefish, became a staple of the Shabbat table, prepared in ways that avoided forbidden labor on holy days. Kugel, a baked pudding of noodles or potatoes, and cholent, a slow-cooked Shabbat stew, reflected the inventive ways Jews observed halakha while creating comforting dishes that fed the soul as well as the body. Ashkenazi Jews also brought a world of sweets and festival foods. Hamantaschen for Purim, latkes for Chanukah, matzah brai for Passover, and blinches for Shavuot. Jewish learning was at the heart of Ashkenazi society. Boys began their education in cheder, elementary religious schools, studying Torah, Hebrew, and basic Talmudic texts from a young age. Advanced students moved on to yeshivot, where hours of study in Gemara, Rashi, and halachic codes formed the backbone of rabbinic scholarship. The Ashkenazi rabbinic tradition produced towering legal authorities such as Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, the Rema, and the Vilna Gaon, whose commentaries and rulings continue to shape Jewish law and practice worldwide. Community structures were often tightly organized through the Kehillah system, a form of local Jewish self-governance responsible for education, charity, ritual slaughter, burial societies, and conflict mediation. Synagogues serve not only as houses of prayer, but as community hubs, courts, and centers of social life. For centuries, the shtetl, small Jewish towns scattered across Eastern Europe, functioned as cultural microcosms. Here, Yiddish signs adorned shops, weddings took over whole streets, peddlers sang, women kept households alive on almost nothing, and Torah study coexisted with earthy humor and practical wisdom. Ashkenazi Jews endured a long history of persecution, expulsions from Western Europe in the medieval period, restrictions under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, massacres by the Cossacks in the 17th century, and increasingly severe pogroms in Tsarist Russia during the 19th and early 20th centuries. Despite these horrors, Ashkenazi communities remained spiritually rich and fiercely tenacious. It was often this combination of oppression and visionary hope that fueled early Zionism. Thinkers such as Theodor Herzl, Achad Ha'am, and Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook emerged from the Ashkenazi world, as did the majority of the early Zionist pioneers. Many Ashkenazi Jews ultimately left Europe for America, South Africa, Argentina, and Israel, in waves of migration that reshaped global Jewry. Others stayed and perished in the Shoah, which decimated the heart of the Ashkenazi civilization. Yet even after the Holocaust, Ashkenazi traditions of language, music, learning, and belief survived and were reborn in new lands, including Israel. The melodies of Nigunim, the warmth of Shabbat Kugel, the joy of Klezmer, and the texts of the Ashkenazi sages continue to echo in the synagogues, kitchens, and classrooms across the Jewish world. The Sephardi Jews, whose name comes from Sfarad, the Hebrew word for Spain, trace their roots to the Jewish communities of the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain and Portugal. For centuries, this community flourished as a vibrant cultural and intellectual force in Jewish and world history. From the grandeur of medieval Spain to the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, the Sephardi legacy is marked by profound scholarship, musical beauty, spiritual depth, and resilience in the face of exile. After the expulsions of the late 15th century, Sephardi Jews spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, carrying with them a cultural heritage that blended Jewish tradition with the sophisticated worlds of their environments. Today, Sephardi influence remains deeply embedded in Israeli society, Jewish law, and diaspora communities around the world. One of the most distinct features of the Sephardi culture is Ladino, also known as Judeo-Spanish, a Judeo-Romance language that evolved from Old Spanish, enriched with Hebrew, Turkish, Arabic, Greek, and other linguistic influences. For Sephardi Jews, Ladino was more than a mother tongue. It was a literary, liturgical, and communal language that preserved the memory of medieval Spain long after exile. Ladino texts included translations of the Bible, or Tanakh, prayer books, ethical works, romances, and collections of proverbs and folk wisdom. The oral tradition was strong. Women, in particular, maintained folklore, lullabies, or canticas, and storytelling practices that passed down history and identity across generations. In cities like Salonika, Istanbul, and Tzfat, Ladino became the dominant language of Jewish life for centuries. Today, efforts to preserve and revive Ladino continue in Israel, Spain, Turkey, and the Americas through music, literature, and academic scholarship. Sephardi liturgical and folk music evolved in dialogue with the diverse cultures of the Mediterranean world. Prayer services featured melodies and modes influenced by Andalusian, Arabic, Turkish, and Balkan music, often using the makam system, a musical framework also used by Mizrahi Jews. Each makam corresponds to a mood or spiritual theme and is often matched to the weekly Torah portion or festival. Sephardi piyutim, or liturgical poems, were composed in both Hebrew and Ladino and often set to beautiful tunes. Poets like Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Solomon ibn Gabirol, and Rabbi Israel Nayara wrote texts that continue to be sung in synagogues today. In daily life, music was present at nearly every ritual milestone: ceremonies, bar mitzvahs, weddings, and mourning. Sephardi Jewish musicians played a major role in the broader musical cultures of the Islamic world, contributing to classical Arabic music, Ottoman court music, and even modern Israeli and Spanish fusion genres. Sephardi Jewry has been a fountain of Jewish intellectual life. During the golden age of Spanish Jewry from the 10th to the 13th centuries, Sephardi thinkers led an unprecedented flowering of Jewish philosophy, science, medicine, and halakha, or Jewish law, often writing in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. Among the giants of this era was Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, or Maimonides, a philosopher, physician, and legal codifier whose Mishneh Torah and Guide for the Perplexed remain foundational texts in Jewish thought. His rationalist approach to halakha and theology continues to influence religious discourse to this day. Sephardi rabbis also led the transmission of Kabbalistic or mystical teachings, especially to the city of Tzfat in the 16th century Ottoman Palestine. Figures like Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Ari, Rabbi Moshe Cordovero, and Rabbi Chaim Vital developed a deeply symbolic and spiritual interpretation of the Torah, festivals, and the human soul. Their teachings shaped the Kabbalat Shabbat liturgy and spread across the Jewish world. In halakha, Sephardi tradition tends to follow the Shulchan Aruch as codified by Rabbi Yosef Karo, also a Tzfat luminary. Sephardi rabbinic decision-making is often known for its pragmatic and inclusive tone while remaining deeply rooted in tradition. Sephardi cuisine is a colorful mosaic that reflects the migration routes of Iberian Jews across the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, the Balkans, and the Levant. Each dish tells the story of adaptation, memory, and celebration. Burekas, flaky pastries filled with cheese, potatoes, or spinach, are a signature snack across Sephardi communities. Pastelikos, small meat pies with delicate dough, often appear at holiday tables. Couscous, brought by North African Jews, is paired with spiced vegetables and savory stews. Fried foods, such as buñuelos or fried dough, are eaten during Hanukkah, while rice-based dishes, stuffed vegetables or dolmas, and sweet and sour meat preparations are common for Shabbat and festivals. Sephardi Jews also brought with them spice blends like baharat and harissa, as well as herbs like mint, coriander, and parsley. During Passover, many Sephardi Jews permit legumes or kitniyot and use unique flourless desserts such as almond cakes and date-stuffed confections, offering a distinct contrast to Ashkenazi traditions. Sephardi synagogues, particularly in cities like Toledo, Istanbul, Rhodes, and Jerusalem, often reflect Moorish, Ottoman, and Mediterranean architectural styles, featuring domed ceilings, colorful tiles, wooden bimot or raised platforms, and ornate arcs. The layout of Sephardi synagogues typically places the bima in the center, promoting a communal and inclusive atmosphere. In many traditions, Torah reading is accompanied by chanting that matches with the regional makam, and the services tend to be less interrupted and more melodic than in some Ashkenazi settings. Distinctive customs also mark life cycle events. Sephardi weddings may feature pre-wedding henna ceremonies. Baby naming ceremonies are common for girls, and funerals are marked by traditional laments and commemorative meals. Religious life is deeply integrated within family and community. The 1492 expulsion from Spain and the 1497 forced conversions in Portugal shattered a centuries-old Jewish civilization, yet Sephardi Jews carried their culture across a wide diaspora, from Morocco and Algeria to Turkey, Greece, Syria, the Netherlands, and the Americas. In many places, they maintained tight-knit communities, preserved liturgical rites, and continued publishing books in Ladino and Hebrew. In modern times, especially after the founding of the State of Israel, Sephardi Jews from the Balkans, Turkey, North Africa, and beyond arrived with deep pride in their heritage, but often encountered marginalization within the dominant Ashkenazi institutions. Despite this, they contributed richly to the emerging Israeli culture, particularly in music, cuisine, religious leadership, and education. Today, the Sephardi legacy endures not only in synagogues and scholarship, but also in the cultural fabric of Israel and the global Jewish community. From the songs of Yasmin Levy and Ehud Banai, to Sephardi yeshivot and rabbinic courts, to the revival of Ladino storytelling, the voice of Sfarad continues to resonate. The Mizrahi Jews, whose name means Eastern in Hebrew, are the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa, who trace their roots back to ancient communities that long predated Islam and even Christianity. These communities, located in lands such as Iraq, Iran, Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Lebanon, and Morocco, represent a continuity of Jewish life that endured for over 2,500 years, deeply woven into the fabric of the Islamic and pre-Islamic Middle Eastern world. Unlike the Sephardi Jews, whose dispersion was shaped by the expulsion from Iberia, Mizrahi Jews are descendants of communities that often never left the broader region of Babylon, Persia, and the Levant, regions deeply intertwined with early Jewish history, including the Babylonian exile and the redaction of the Talmud. Mizrahi culture is rooted in oral traditions, musical spirituality, family-centric customs, and a uniquely intimate relationship with Islamic society, adapting to its aesthetics, cuisine, philosophy, and language while maintaining a distinct Jewish identity. Mizrahi Jews spoke a range of Judeo-Arabic dialects, Judeo-Persian, Judeo-Aramaic, and Hebrew. In each of these languages, they developed their own written scripts, often Hebrew characters applied to Arabic or Persian, commentaries, religious texts, and folk literature. Judeo-Arabic, in particular, was a bridge between Jewish traditions and the surrounding Arab cultures. Works such as Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed were originally written in Judeo-Arabic, and everyday Jewish life, from legal documents to poetry, was conducted in these dialects. Oral storytelling was essential. Elders passed down legends of ancient prophets, moral parables, and family sagas, often framed in local idioms. Women played a central role in preserving folk tales and songs. These narratives not only entertained, but preserved a sense of history and identity, especially important in societies where Jews were a protected minority, but often lived with social restrictions. Mizrahi synagogue music is characterized by the maqam system, a set of musical modes rooted in Arabic and Persian classical traditions. Each maqam conveys a particular emotional or spiritual mood and is chosen carefully to correspond with the weekly Torah portion, holiday, or theme of the day. This system gave Mizrahi Jewish prayer services a rich and improvised quality. Cantors, or chazanim, were highly trained not only in Torah chanting, but also in the full musical vocabulary of the maqamat, enabling them to weave deep meaning into the melodies. In Iraq and Syria, Bakashot, a set of poetic liturgical songs sung before dawn on Shabbat, became an essential part of the winter liturgical experience. These songs combined Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic, and were passed down with great care in oral tradition. In Yemen, a unique ancient form of Hebrew chanting known as Temani chanting developed, preserving a more guttural and metered rhythm, often considered closest to the biblical pronunciation. Musical instruments were generally avoided on Shabbat and festivals, but were a key part of Mizrahi weddings, circumcisions, and other life cycle events, featuring the Ode, Kanun, and Darbuka, and accompanied by traditional Jewish Arabic songs. Mizrahi Jewish life was deeply family-oriented, with customs built around respect for elders and communal celebration. Extended families often lived in close proximity or shared compounds, fostering a tight-knit social fabric. Each holiday had its own unique rituals and foods, from the elaborate Passover Mimuna celebrations in Morocco to the singing of Shabbat Zmirot in Iraqi households, to henna ceremonies before weddings in Yemen and Iran. Women adorned themselves with brightly colored dresses, silver jewelry, and traditional headdresses, styles that varied widely by region, from flowing kaftans in North Africa to embroidered robes in Mesopotamia. Customs surrounding childbirth, naming, circumcision, and mourning were highly codified and saturated with symbolic acts and community involvement. Blessings were recited over fragrant herbs, bread was sprinkled with rosewater, and homes were decorated for the Shabbat as sacred spaces. Mizrahi cuisine is one of the most aromatic, colorful, and diverse expressions of Jewish culture. Drawing from Arabic, Persian, Kurdish, Berber, and Ottoman culinary traditions, it reflects the lands in which the Mizrahi Jews lived, but always with a unique kosher interpretation. Iconic dishes include kube, a semolina or bulgur dumplings filled with spiced meat in rich broth like beet, lemon, or tomato. Sabich, a fried eggplant sandwich with hard-boiled egg, tahini, and amba, a pickled mango sauce with Indian roots. Jachnun, a Yemenite Sabbath dish of rolled, slow-cooked dough served with grated tomato and hard-boiled eggs. Tabit, or Iraqi cholent, a spiced chicken and rice dish left to simmer overnight for Shabbat. And tzchug, a fiery herbal condiment made with coriander, garlic, and chilies. Every dish was more than nourishment. It was bound to a festival, a ritual, a family story. And even after immigration to Israel, these recipes remained a crucial link to ancestral lands. While many Mizrahi Jews lived under the dhimmi status in Islamic lands, so they were protected but subordinate, they nevertheless produced towering rabbis and scholars. Yeshivot in Baghdad, Aleppo, and Cairo nurtured halachic rulings, biblical commentaries, and responsa literature that reflected both rabbinic depth and practical community needs. Religious life was managed locally by hachakim, or sages, respected leaders who often acted as a spiritual guide, judges, and mediators. Unlike the Ashkenazi model of centralized yeshivot, Mizrahi rabbinic life was typically more integrated into everyday family and communal structures. Mizrahi Jews maintained distinct legal traditions and prayer rites, often following the Edot HaMizrach, or Eastern communities' liturgy. Unlike the Sephardi emphasis on post-Spanish exile customs, Mizrahi Judaism remained rooted in Babylonian and Talmudic traditions that had developed over a millennium of relative isolation from Europe. In the mid-20th century, geopolitical shifts led to the rapid collapse of the ancient Mizrahi communities. The founding of the State of Israel, coupled with rising Arab nationalism, triggered violence, expulsions, and widespread confiscation of property. Over 850,000 Mizrahi Jews fled or were forced out of their home countries between the 1940s and 1970s. Many arrived in Israel via airlifts like Operation Magic Carpet for Yemenite Jews, or through arduous, unpublicized escape routes. They were settled in ma'abarot, or transit camps, development towns, or peripheral villages, often with limited resources and little understanding from the largely Ashkenazi establishment. Their traditional, often religious lifestyles were met with suspicion. Hebrew was prioritized over Arabic and Judeo-Arabic, and Mizrahi children were sometimes discouraged from speaking their native languages. Despite many challenges, Mizrahi Jews held onto their identity with fierce pride. They established synagogues, schools, and cultural centers that reflected their heritage. Over time, their music, food, and rituals became central to Israeli life. Today, Mizrahi culture is deeply woven into the national fabric of Israel. Artists like Ofar Chaza, Zohar Argov, and Eyal Golan brought Middle Eastern music into the Israeli mainstream. Dishes like kube, lachuch, and mafrum are now staples of Israeli cuisine. Politically, Mizrahi activism, particularly through movements like the Israeli Black Panthers in the 1970s, challenged inequalities and reshaped conversations around ethnicity and justice. In academia, a growing body of Mizrahi scholarship and literature seeks to reclaim lost histories and celebrate cultural pluralism. Internationally, Mizrahi Jews continue to thrive in the diaspora, from Los Angeles to Paris to Montreal, keeping alive unique traditions while navigating multicultural identities. Mizrahi Jewry is not merely a relic of the past. It is a living, evolving identity rooted in faith, resilience, and the rhythms of the East. Amidst the dispersal of Jews across the world following the destruction of the First and Second Temples, a continuous Jewish presence endured in the land of Israel. While much of Jewish history is characterized by exile and return, there have always been Jews who remained, particularly in Jerusalem, Tzfat, Hebron, Tiberias, and surrounding rural areas. These communities preserved elements of ancient Hebrew, ritual practice, and spiritual tradition that directly link contemporary Judaism with its historical roots in the land. Far from being isolated remnants, these Jews were caretakers of continuity, maintaining a living relationship with the soil, the sacred texts, and the Hebrew calendar. Their customs, language, and liturgical practices formed a cultural thread unbroken by centuries of upheaval. One of the most remarkable aspects of Jewish continuity in the land is the preservation of ancient forms of Hebrew pronunciation. The Tiberian vocalization system, developed in the city of Tiberias between the 7th and 10th centuries CE, became the standard for written Hebrew vocalization through the Masoretic text. Though eventually superseded in daily speech, elements of this pronunciation remain embedded in scholarly tradition. The Yemenite pronunciation, maintained by Jews in both Yemen and parts of the land of Israel, is widely regarded by linguists and traditional scholars as among the most faithful to biblical Hebrew. Yemenite Jews preserve distinctions between guttural letters chet, ain, aleph, and used phonetic nuances that recall the ancient spoken language. These pronunciation traditions serve not just linguistic purposes, but preserved a sonic connection to sacred texts and oral transmission. The Jewish quarter of Jerusalem's Old City has been inhabited continuously by Jews for centuries, despite periods of upheaval. By the medieval period, Jews living in Jerusalem were often scholars, mystics, and scribes who safeguarded religious texts and rituals. These communities remained small but deeply rooted, maintaining traditions of prayer, Torah study, and communal solidarity through Ottoman, Mamluk, and early Islamic rule. Elsewhere in the Galilee, especially in Tzfat, the 16th century witnessed a flowering of Jewish mysticism. Following the Spanish expulsion in 1492, many Sephardi sages settled in Tzfat, merging Iberian scholarship with ancient land-based spirituality. It was here that figures such as Rabbi Isaac Luria, the Arizal, and Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz developed a revolutionary school of Kabbalah, deeply rooted in the sanctity of the land and its spiritual dimensions. Their mystical teachings, infused with longing for redemption and connection to the divine presence in Zion, influenced Jewish thought for generations and continue to shape Friday night Kabbalat Shabbat rituals and broader Jewish spirituality. The Jews who lived in the land of Israel developed distinctive clothing and ritual customs, often reflecting a blend of traditional Jewish modesty and local cultural aesthetics. Men in old Yishuv communities in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Tzfat wore robes, kaftans, and sashes, garments reminiscent of both Ottoman dress and ancient biblical attire. Women's garments, especially for festivals and weddings, featured intricate embroidery, veils, and jewelry inherited through generations. A particularly rich tradition among these communities is the composition and preservation of piyutim, liturgical poems sung during services, festivals, and life cycle events. These compositions, often in Hebrew and Aramaic, blend theological reflection with poetic beauty and musical expression. Many of them contain longing for the land, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and the ingathering of exiles, echoes of the lived experience of Jews who remained in proximity to their ancestral home. Unlike Jews in the Diaspora, those who remained in the land lived close to its agricultural cycles, often maintaining practices rooted in biblical commandments. Jewish farmers in the Galilee or the Judean hills observed the Shemitah, sabbatical year, gave Trumot and Maaserot, and timed their harvests to coincide with Torah festivals like Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. These imbued the Jewish calendar with immediate physical relevance. Sukkot was not just a symbolic holiday, it marked the end of the fruit harvest. Shavuot was celebrated with freshly baked loaves and new dairy, reflecting the actual bounty of the land. These traditions created a bond between religious identity and ecological awareness, unbroken by the urbanization or exile that shaped other Jewish communities. Even today, in moshavim and agricultural settlements across Israel, these ancient agricultural cycles continue to influence Jewish life and tradition. The Jews who never left the land of Israel stand as a bridge between past and present, living testimony to the endurance of Jewish connection to the land. Their customs, pronunciation, and spiritual practices reveal an unbroken chain of heritage tied not only to text but to soil, season, and sacred geography. In modern Israel, their legacy is seen in liturgy, language, and local traditions that continue to shape national identity and spiritual life. The modern return of Jews to the land of Israel began long before the State of Israel was declared in 1948. Between 1882 and 1939, 5 major waves of Aliyah, or Jewish immigration to the ancestral land, transformed a scattered and largely agrarian society into the ideological and cultural crucible of the modern Jewish state. These waves brought with them Zionist ideology, agricultural experimentation, social revolution, and complex interethnic dynamics. The new arrivals, mostly from Europe, joined long-standing Sephardi and Mizrahi communities, setting the stage for a layered and sometimes contentious cultural encounter that shaped modern Israeli society. The first Aliyah, from 1882 to 1903, was largely led by Jews from Eastern Europe, fleeing pogroms and rising anti-Semitism in the Russian Empire. Inspired by the early Zionist thinkers and religious longing for return, they founded agricultural settlements like Rishon LeZion, Petach Tikva, and Zichron Yaakov. These pioneers were motivated by a mix of religious devotion and secular nationalism. The second Aliyah, between 1904 and 1914, brought more ideologically driven immigrants, many of whom were secular socialist youth influenced by Marxist and labor ideals. This wave laid the groundwork for the kibbutz movement, establishing communal agricultural settlements rooted in egalitarian principles. They also revived Hebrew as a spoken language, transforming it from a sacred tongue to a modern national vernacular. Under the British Mandate of 1917 to 1948, the third, fourth, and fifth Aliyot brought successive waves of Jews fleeing post-war instability, rising nationalism in Eastern Europe, and the Nazi threat. These immigrants, many of them urban professionals, artisans, and middle-class families, helped develop cities like Tel Aviv, foster cultural institutions, and expand educational systems. While early Zionist immigration was primarily Ashkenazi, the land was not empty, nor was its Jewish population monolithic. Existing Sephardi and Mizrahi communities had deep cultural traditions, ties to the land, and local knowledge. However, many of the European newcomers regarded them through an Orientalist lens as less modern, less ideological, and less Europeanized. Yet over time, shared agricultural labor, military threats, and national challenges forced greater cooperation and mutual influence, especially in places where Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews worked and lived side by side. The Zionist return was not only physical, it was also symbolic. The land itself became a canvas for renewal, where farming became an act of national redemption. The kibbutzim and moshavim, or cooperative villages, established during this era, were laboratories of social experimentation and cultural creativity. At the same time, Hebrew was revived as a living language thanks to the efforts by figures like Eliezer ben Yehuda, who adapted ancient roots to modern needs. Streets, newspapers, scientific terms, and children's school books all became part of a linguistic renaissance that helped unify immigrants from different backgrounds. National symbols also took shape: the flag, the Hatikva anthem, and the calendar of commemorative days, Yom HaZikaron, or Memorial Day, to Yom HaAtzmaut, or Independence Day, emerged in this early period. Despite their marginalization, Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews played a vital role in preserving continuity with Jewish spiritual life in the region. Their presence reminded the newcomers that their connection to the land was not just a matter of political ideology, but also of sacred tradition. This foundational period set the tone for modern Israel, a society built through ideological fervor, cultural tension, and communal resilience. It created institutions, defined linguistic and national symbols, and shaped a deeply rooted ethos of revival, one that would be tested and reshaped by the next waves of Aliyah from Holocaust survivors, Middle Eastern Jews, and later Ethiopian and Russian communities. The years following the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 marked one of the most significant periods of demographic and cultural transformation in Jewish history. In less than 2 decades, Israel absorbed hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, many arriving under crisis, all reshaping the state in profound ways. These waves of Aliyah, driven by survival, displacement, ideology, and hope, created the melting pot in which a deeply diverse Jewish population would have to learn to coexist and, in time, build a shared society. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, between 250 to 300,000 Jewish survivors of Nazi persecution were left in displaced persons camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy. For many, returning to their countries of origin was unthinkable. Entire communities had been annihilated, and anti-Semitism often remained virulent in post-war Europe. Zionism, long seen by some as a fringe ideology, now became a lifeline. The hope of a Jewish homeland was not merely spiritual, it was practical and urgent. The struggle to reach Israel began even before the state was founded. The Exodus, 1947, a ship carrying over 4,500 Holocaust survivors, was intercepted by the British and turned back to Europe, becoming a symbol of the cruel barriers that delayed Jewish return. After the Declaration of Independence in May 1948 and the dismantling of British immigration restrictions, the floodgates opened. Many of these European immigrants arrived physically weakened, psychologically scarred, and emotionally burdened with loss. But they also brought rich cultural traditions, Yiddish language, Eastern European food, religious practices, and memories of vanished shtetls. They carried a fierce determination to rebuild, to create families, and to contribute to the collective project of Jewish sovereignty. They were settled rapidly, sometimes in tents or crude housing. The state, barely surviving its war of independence, faced an enormous logistical challenge, the feeding, housing, and integrating a population that had endured unimaginable trauma. At the same time, an entirely different wave of Aliyah was underway. With the rise of Arab nationalism, the creation of Israel ignited violent backlash against the long-established Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa. From Baghdad to Casablanca, synagogues were torched, Jews were imprisoned or killed, and thousands fled their homes, often leaving behind property, wealth, and centuries of cultural heritage. Between 1948 and the early 1960s, roughly 850,000 Jews were expelled or fled from Arab and Muslim countries. Many were rescued in organized operations. The most famous of these was Operation Magic Carpet, 1949 to 1950, in which Israel airlifted nearly 50,000 Yemenite Jews in secret missions from villages and mountaintops to the newly established Jewish state. These immigrants came with nothing but their faith, their oral traditions, and their sense of belonging to an ancient Israelite lineage. Other large groups came from Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Morocco, Tunisia, Iran, and Turkey. Each community had its own dialect, customs, foods, and religious practices. Unlike the European survivors, many of these Jews were deeply religious and had lived for centuries in the heart of Islamic civilizations. Their arrival posed complex challenges. They too were housed in ma'abarot, often in distant or underdeveloped areas. Despite some tensions, something extraordinary happened. A new Israeli culture began to emerge. Cuisine became one of the earliest and most accessible arenas for cultural blending. Markets began to sell spicy North African merguez, Iraqi amba and sabich, Yemenite jachnun and khilbe, alongside Ashkenazi kugel and matzo ball soup. Shabbat tables across Israel began to reflect the fusion of culinary heritage with dishes influenced by family roots stretching across continents. Music also became the site of synthesis and transformation. The Mizrahi musical tradition, built on Makam modal systems, Arabic instruments, and centuries-old synagogue melodies, met European harmonies and Western instruments. Early Israeli radio largely excluded Mizrahi music, but informal street performances, wedding bands, and underground cassette culture kept it alive. Eventually, singers like Zohar Argov, Ofra Chaza, and Dudu Tassa helped bring Mizrahi music into the national consciousness, paving the way for what would become Israeli pop. Neighborhood life during this era was deeply shaped by cultural proximity. In new development towns such as Dimona, Beit Shean, and Kiryat Shmona, immigrants from similar backgrounds were often clustered together, recreating the rhythms and rituals of home. Daily life revolved around extended families, neighborhood synagogues, communal meals, and Shabbat gatherings. In Jerusalem and southern Tel Aviv, Sephardi and Mizrahi communities revived their customs while adapting to their new surroundings. These neighborhoods often lacked adequate infrastructure, but they were also fertile ground for the evolution of Israeli urban culture. By the end of the 1960s, Israel had transformed from a primarily European settled land into a multi-ethnic Jewish homeland, with Jews from over 100 countries contributing to its social, cultural, and religious fabric. The tensions of this era were real, but the vibrancy of Israeli society today cannot be understood without the mass Aliyah and communal reinvention. This generation built the foundations of modern Israel, not just physically in terms of towns, roads, and institutions, but culturally, infusing the state with deep textures of exile, return, and rooted identity. For generations, the Jews of Ethiopia, known as Beta Israel, lived in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, preserving their faith under difficult conditions and maintaining a powerful spiritual connection to Jerusalem. Their migration to Israel in the late 20th century was not only a physical journey of thousands of kilometers, but also a profound cultural and religious reawakening, a reconnection to a people and land they had prayed for across millennia. The origins of Ethiopian Jewry are the subject of scholarly debate, but the community itself traces its ancestry back to ancient Israel. Whether through descent from the tribe of Dan, as held in Ethiopian tradition, or via Jewish migration southward during the First and Second Temple periods, Beit Israel developed as a distinct Jewish community in relative isolation from Rabbinic Judaism. Cut off from the Babylonian Talmud and with no knowledge of the Rabbinic halachic tradition, Beit Israel practiced a Torah-centric form of Judaism rooted in biblical commandments. They observed Shabbat, kashrut, family purity laws, circumcision, and fast days with great devotion, while maintaining strong communal structures around priests called kesim, who served as spiritual guides, judges, and preservers of oral law. Despite marginalization, discrimination, and periodic persecution from their Christian and Muslim neighbors, Beit Israel survived for centuries, holding fast to a singular hope to return to Zion. Jerusalem was not an abstract symbol. It was the spiritual anchor of their identity. The phrase, "next year in Jerusalem," was not just recited at Passover. It was a living aspiration. The opportunity for Aliyah began to take shape in the late 1970s as civil unrest in Ethiopia and a growing humanitarian crisis in the Horn of Africa brought international attention to the plight of the Jewish community. Following years of covert communication, Mossad operatives, the Israeli government, and American Jewish organizations began coordinating a massive and secretive rescue operation. In 1984 to 1985, Operation Moses airlifted over 8,000 Ethiopian Jews from refugee camps in Sudan to Israel in a mission shrouded in secrecy. Tragically, thousands more died during the grueling journey, fleeing Ethiopia by foot, crossing deserts, enduring violence and starvation before ever reaching Sudan. Families were torn apart, with many parents believing their children had died, only to later discover they had survived and were living in Israel. Shortly after Operation Moses was halted due to leaks in the media, Operation Joshua, coordinated by the US government, airlifted another 500 Jews from Sudan to Israel. The most dramatic mission came in 1991, as civil war engulfed Addis Ababa and the Ethiopian government collapsed. Israel launched Operation Solomon, a 36-hour airlift that brought over 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel on dozens of flights, some using military cargo planes modified to carry passengers. It was one of the largest humanitarian airlifts in history. For many Ethiopian Jews, this was the fulfillment of a centuries-old dream, but arriving in Israel brought new challenges they were not prepared for. Ethiopian immigrants faced immediate and intense cultural dissonance. Coming from rural, often agrarian communities with little exposure to modern technology or urban living, they were suddenly placed in a fast-paced, westernized society with unfamiliar customs, languages, and norms. Religiously, the integration process was fraught with misunderstanding and tension. Language was another barrier. Children adapted quickly, learning Hebrew and entering the school system. But many elders, particularly those from non-literate backgrounds, struggled to navigate the bureaucracy of Israeli life. Despite the many challenges, Ethiopian Israelis began to organize with full inclusion into Israeli society. Ethiopian Jews brought with them a profoundly spiritual culture, rich in ritual, music, storytelling, and communal ethics. The Qasim, still active spiritual leaders in many Ethiopian Israeli communities, preside over life cycle events such as births, weddings, and funerals. Though they do not serve in the same role as rabbis, they remain revered figures for their knowledge of biblical law, liturgy, and Ethiopian Jewish history. Their Torah readings in Ge'ez, their use of ritual prayer staffs, and their white robes create a visual and auditory landscape unique in Jewish religious expression. Ethiopian Jewish music is marked by pentatonic scales, vocal chants, and the use of traditional instruments like the krar, a 6-string lyre, and kabero drums. These sounds, once heard only in remote villages, now echo in Israeli streets, weddings, and concert halls, contributing to the mosaic of Israeli music. Family remains the central unit of Ethiopian Jewish life. Households often span 3 generations, and values of respect for elders, hospitality, and communal responsibility are passed down with care. Traditional foods such as injera, a fermented flatbread, dabo, sweet Sabbath bread, shiro, spiced chickpea stew, and kitfo, seasoned minced meat, are shared at Shabbat tables. In addition, new generations of Ethiopian Israelis have begun reinterpreting their heritage through art, theatre, poetry, and hip-hop, using Hebrew, Amharic, and even Ge'ez to explore themes of identity, exile, faith, and belonging. By the early 2000s, over 130,000 Ethiopian Jews had immigrated to Israel. A younger generation, born in Israel or raised since childhood, had risen to positions of leadership, creativity, and activism. Ethiopian Israelis serve in the Knesset, in the IDF, and in municipal leadership roles. Artists like Esther Rada, Aveva, and Idan Reichel, through collaboration, have helped bring Ethiopian sounds to national and international audiences. Writers and filmmakers tell stories once hidden from view, and young activists organize protests demanding recognition and equality. In their journey from the highlands of Gondar to the cities of Jerusalem, Beersheba, and Netanya, Ethiopian Jews have enriched the cultural, spiritual, and moral fabric of Israel. Their presence is a living testimony to the enduring pull of Zion and the capacity of the Jewish people to gather, heal, and grow. The story of Russian-speaking Jews who immigrated to Israel during the late 20th century is one of rekindled identity, political awakening, and cultural transformation. Emerging from decades, sometimes generations, of religious suppression, these Jews brought with them a legacy of intellectual rigor, resilience, and a thirst for freedom. Their Aliyah reshaped Israeli society in profound ways, infusing it with a new demographic, a unique cultural ethos, and a determination to reclaim both Jewish belonging and personal agency. For most Jews in the Soviet Union, identity was a paradox, officially documented, yet culturally suppressed. Soviet internal passports famously included the line "nationality Jewish," branding Jews as a distinct ethnic group. Yet open religious observance, Hebrew language study, and Zionist expression were forbidden. Synagogues were monitored. Hebrew teachers were arrested. Torah scrolls were hidden in basements. Circumcision was discouraged. Jewish holidays were erased from public life. Zionism was painted as a form of Western treason. And yet, through whispered stories, family customs, and the flickering memory of Yiddish lullabies, Jewish identity endured. Despite being secularized by the Soviet regime, many Russian Jews retained a fierce sense of ethnic pride, intellectual heritage, and a longing, often abstract, for Israel. For others, Jewish identity lay dormant, half forgotten, but reignited later by the challenges of discrimination, anti-Semitic quotas, and the refusal of full belonging in their birth countries. By the 1970s, a small but determined group known as refuseniks, those denied exit visas by the Soviet authorities, became symbols of Jewish resistance. Figures like Natan Sharansky galvanized international attention, turning the cause of Soviet Jewry into a global Jewish movement. Synagogues in New York, Melbourne, Paris, and London held rallies. Protesters chained themselves to fences. The phrase, "Let my people go," became a defining call of Jewish moral conscience in the late 20th century. The 1970s marked the first major Soviet Aliyah, primarily composed of Jews from Russia, Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic republics. Roughly 160,000 Jews emigrated during this period, some to Israel, others to the US and Europe. Those who came to Israel often faced a jarring cultural transition. Highly educated professionals, engineers, doctors, teachers, were often assigned menial jobs due to language barriers and non-recognition of Soviet credentials. Many were secular and unfamiliar with Jewish religious practices, making integration into religious or traditional Jewish communities complex. Still, these olim, or immigrants, carried with them a strong commitment to education, a rigorous scientific orientation, and a fierce drive to succeed. They built communities, joined Israel's scientific and technological institutions, and pushed their children to excel, values that would deeply influence the next, much larger wave of Aliyah. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 opened the floodgates. Between 1989 and the early 2000s, over 1 million Russian-speaking Jews and their family members made Aliyah from across the former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and the Caucasus. This was one of the largest and most sudden demographic shifts in Israeli history. Within a decade, Russian-speaking Jews made up over 15% of Israel's population, transforming neighborhoods, schools, political parties, and cultural institutions almost overnight. Many arrived with limited resources, but high levels of education. Israel quickly faced the challenge of absorbing 1 million new citizens. Housing, employment, language training, education, and medical care were needed on a massive scale. Despite hardship, this generation of immigrants left an indelible mark. They revitalized the health sector. Nearly 40% of Israeli doctors today have Soviet backgrounds, enriched universities and research institutions, and introduced a cultural style defined by intellectual rigor, formality, and pride in heritage. Russian-speaking Jews brought with them not only demographic weight, but a rich and distinct culture. Hebrew became the working language, but Russian remained the language of the home, the newspaper, the bookstore, and the stage. Russian language newspapers like Vesti, radio stations, and television programs flourished in Israel. Russian theaters were established in Tel Aviv and Haifa, featuring everything from classical Chekhov to contemporary Israeli-Russian playwrights. Bookstores stocked Russian translations of Israeli works and vice versa. Ballet companies, classical music ensembles, and film directors shaped the Israeli cultural scene, often winning international acclaim. Russian cuisine made its way into Israeli markets and homes. Borscht, pelmeni, herring under fur coat, and blini became comfort foods for thousands of families. At the same time, many Russian-speaking olim, especially youth, began navigating hybrid identities, balancing Russian heritage, Israeli patriotism, and Jewish belonging. One of the most complex aspects of Russian Aliyah was the question of Jewish status. Russian-speaking Israelis soon became a potent political force. In 1999, the emergence of Israel Beitenu party under Avigdor Lieberman, himself a Moldovan-born immigrant, gave voice to the frustration of many Russian Jews, demanding stronger security policies, recognition of their cultural identity, and reforms in religion-state issues. Meanwhile, Russian-speaking youth have climbed the ranks of the IDF, academia, high-tech, arts, and even Olympic sports, earning distinction in many fields. The integration of successive generations continues to unfold, marked by both cultural retention and a dynamic transformation. For many Russian-speaking Jews, Aliyah was both an act of return and a process of reinvention. They left behind the ruins of empire, pogroms, and purges of totalitarianism. They brought with them Pushkin and Pasternak, Talmud fragments and family recipes, Soviet-era skepticism, and Jewish yearning. In Israel, they found a country often unfamiliar with their story, but a people determined to make space for them. Today, Russian-speaking Jews continue to wrestle with what it means to be Jewish, Israeli, and post-Soviet. In today's Israel, Jewish life reflects a dynamic mosaic of identities, a remarkable cultural convergence forged through waves of immigration, historical trauma, ancestral pride, and ongoing dialogue between tradition and modernity. With just over 75 years, the Jewish people, returning from exile and dispersion across over 100 countries, have formed a society that is at once ancient and emergent, shaped by the heritage of millennia and the immediacy of contemporary Israeli life. Israel is not a melting pot where differences dissolve into uniformity, but rather a living tapestry in which diverse threads are woven into something cohesive and vibrant. The result is a society where Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, Ethiopian, Russian, Yemenite, and many other Jewish heritages coexist, intermarry, and interact, each retaining something unique while also contributing to a shared national identity. One of the most striking aspects of modern Israeli Jewish life is the interweaving of ethnic customs with family life. In any given home or neighborhood, one might find Moroccan harira soup served alongside Polish cholent, or a Shabbat table featuring kuba from Iraq, challah from Lithuania, and matbucha from North Africa. Intermarriage between Jews of different diasporic origins has become increasingly common, creating merged family traditions. A wedding might feature both Ashkenazi Bedeken and Mizrahi henna ceremonies. A bar mitzvah might include Sephardi liturgical tunes alongside Eastern European-style Torah chanting. On holidays, families draw from the vast reservoir of diasporic practice, blending Persian Purim pastries with Yemenite Sikh-inspired customs on Shavuot, or lighting Hanukkah candles in glass boxes like in Jerusalem's Old Yishuv, while singing Ladino romanceros. What was once separate and sometimes competitive is now part of a shared Israeli experience, enriched by each tradition's contribution. Nowhere is this cultural convergence more evident than in Israeli pop culture, especially in music, film, television, and food. Once dominated by European aesthetics and ideology, Israeli culture in the 21st century has made space for the sounds, stories, and styles of Mizrahi and Sephardi communities. Music is perhaps the clearest example. Israeli radio once excluded Mizrahi artists from mainstream airplay, but now genres like Mizrahi pop, Mediterranean fusion, and ethnic rock dominate charts and fill stadiums. Artists such as Eyal Golan, Sarit Haddad, and Dudu Tassa seamlessly blend Arabic rhythms, Hebrew lyrics, electric guitars, and ancient piyutim. Israeli film and television have likewise diversified. Series like Shababnikim, Fauda, and Shtisel showcase different facets of Israeli Jewish society, from ultra-Orthodox yeshiva students to Mizrahi counterterrorism agents, reflecting the spectrum of real lives. Fashion designers incorporate traditional Yemenite embroidery. Visual artists reference North African symbols. Food programs celebrate fusion, like sabich with Russian pickles, or burekas filled with beetroot and goat cheese. This mainstreaming of cultural diversity marks a shift from earlier decades, when Mizrahi and non-European Jews often had to suppress their heritage to succeed in Israel public life. One of the boldest transformations in Israeli Jewish identity is linguistic. In just a few generations, Hebrew has been revived from a sacred language of prayer into the everyday, spoken tongue of millions. Today, it is the dominant language in homes, schools, business, military, and media, uniting Jews from vastly different backgrounds. But this doesn't mean the disappearance of other Jewish languages. Yiddish, Ladino, Judeo-Arabic, Amharic, Russian, French, and Persian continue to echo in private conversations. Elderly Yemenite Jews still chant piyutim in archaic Hebrew. Grandparents tell jokes in Russian or sing lullabies in Ladino. The Jewish return to the land of Israel has always been more than a political project. It is a cultural, spiritual, and civilizational rebirth. As Israel matures, the central question becomes not only how to preserve identity, but how to live it authentically in a modern, diverse, and interconnected society. With the legacies of diaspora communities converging in a single nation, Jewish identity in Israel is evolving. The story of the Jews of Israel is a tapestry woven from countless threads, from the earliest settlers who made their homes in the hills of Judea, to the diverse immigrants arriving from Europe, North Africa, Middle East, Ethiopia, and the former Soviet Union. The Jewish people in Israel today embody a remarkable mosaic of identities and histories. This complexity is not a weakness, but a profound strength. It reflects a people who have endured centuries of displacement, persecution, and transformation, yet never lost their connection to the land or to each other. Israel's Jewish society is neither monolithic nor static. It is ever-evolving, shaped by ongoing dialogues between the past and the present. The enduring sense of unity, the recognition of a shared heritage, language, and future, does not erase difference, but embraces it. The House of David, once a royal lineage, today symbolizes a broader spiritual and cultural home for all Jewish people, no matter where their families originated or which customs they cherish. This unity amid diversity offers important lessons for the leadership, community, and identity in the modern world. It teaches us that belonging does not require uniformity, and that resilience grows from respect and inclusion. The Israeli experience invites us to see identity as layered and multifaceted, rather than fixed or exclusive. Moreover, the ongoing journey of the Jews in Israel challenges simplistic narratives. It reminds us that history is complex and lived experience is rich. As we look ahead, the future of Jewish life in Israel depends on the willingness to continue this work, to honor roots while embracing innovation, to listen deeply to one another's stories, and to build a society that values every voice. In this way, The story of the Jews of Israel is not just a chronicle of the past. It is a living testament to human endurance, creativity, and hope. It is a story that continues to unfold, inviting each generation to add their own chapter to the ongoing journey of a people who remain deeply connected to their land, their history, and to one another. Thank you so much for being with me, and I hope to see you soon in my next video.